Welcome back after that hopefully helpful theory lecture. So now let's keep talking about creating and sizing grid columns and grid rows. So in our very first lecture about CSS Grid, we already learned how to create columns and rows like this, right? Now for me, actually most of the magic of CSS Grid comes from a very new unit, which is the FR unit. So using the FR unit here instead of pixels will allow us to very easily create flexible columns and flexible rows. So again, using pixels allows us to only give these tracks very rigid dimensions. So these here are always 200 pixels no matter what. So if I resize this like this or like this, the size always stays the same here of these columns, right? So at some point it even overflowed the container, right? And so many times that is not what we need. And instead we want flexible columns and rows. And so as I said in the beginning, for that we can use the new FR unit. So let's say, for example, that we want this last column here to always fill up all the remaining space. Or maybe let's say this column. All right. Let's just decrease this spacing a little bit so we can see it better. Maybe this one as well. Okay. So clearly here we have this empty space that is waiting to be filled. And so let's fill that very easily with this third column in this case. So the third column is this one, right? And so here, instead of specifying a fixed pixel value, let's specify 1 FR, which stands for fractional or just fraction. And if I give it a save now, then you see that this column has been expanded in order to fill all the available empty space. So it's a little bit like setting flex to 1 in Flexbox, right? And so now, as we adjust the size here of the window, then you see that it always keeps expanding to fit all the available space. So now here it's getting really small, and so at a certain point it still needs to fit the content, and so therefore then our grid will again overflow. But at all this other width, then this column here will attempt to fill all the remaining space. Okay, let's try the same with this one. So we can also set this one to the same value. So also 1 FR. And so if we do that, then what do you think will happen to these two columns? And that's right. They are now the exact same size because they have the exact same value here for the FR unit. All right. And so again, they are now the same size. And if we resize, then both of them are trying to fill the remaining empty space. And they do that basically in the same proportion because they both have the same value here. All right. And I will show you in a second what happens when we give them here different values. All right. But for now, I actually want you to think about how we can create a grid where all the columns are the same width. So I want you to pause the video here and create a grid where all 4 columns have the same width. Then you can do the same for 2 columns and for 3 columns. All right. So experiment a little bit with that, and I see you back here in a minute. All right. So hopefully you spent a minute doing that. And here I will now actually copy this and then turn this one off, just so we keep this code here. But now, hopefully you arrived at the solution that if we want 4 colors with the same width, we need to set all of these here to 1 FR. So 1 FR, all of them. And so now, no matter what, they will always have the same size. Right? So this is very powerful and very useful, and we do this kind of thing all the time. And if we remove one of them, then we will end up only with 3 columns, but they still have all the same size. So they all try to fill up the available space and all in the same proportion. And the same, of course, for just 2 columns. But let's put it back to 4 columns like this. So let's quickly review what's happening here. So in this grid container, there is basically initially all of this empty space here. So all the way from this side to this side. And then as we use the FR unit here like this, then all of that empty space will get divided up equally between these 4 columns. And that is because each of them has the same value here. So each of them is 1. But now let's see what happened if we changed one of them to 2, for example. So let's see. And now this one here gets double the space than all the other columns. So now the space basically is divided into 5 fractions. So 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 5 fractions. And so out of these 5 fractions, the first column gets 2 of them, and the remaining ones get each of them each. And the same is true as we keep increasing the size here. Let's say 3. Then this should now have half of the space. And to see this in reality, let's make this a bit bigger. Right. And let's inspect this also, just so we see that this is true. So this grid now has a width of 1096. So let's make it a bit smaller. So I want to make it 1000 pixels to make it easier to understand. And that's close enough. And so this one here gets approximately 500 pixels, which is half. And then these other columns here have a lot less. So that's basically a sixth of the available space. And I know that this one here is half because now we have 6 units. So 3 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 6. And the first one gets 3, which is half. Right? So this is very important stuff and very helpful. And just like in Flexbox, this allows us to not having to specify width manually. Okay, now going back here to equal sized columns, I actually want to show you something else. So here we can also specify the auto keyword instead of one of these units. So if we say auto, for example, on the 4th column, then it will only take exactly the size that is necessary to fill its content. And many times in practice, this is actually exactly what we need for one of the columns. So this one here is important to keep in mind. Okay? But let's once again turn this off, because now I want to even show you something else again. So let's write grid template columns again, because there is actually an easier way of writing 4 times FR like we did here. So instead, CSS Grid introduced a repeat function where we can simply write repeat, then open parentheses, and then write how many columns you want and how large they should be. So let's say 1 FR, and there we go. So this is equivalent to just writing 1 FR 4 times. And so one more time, CSS Grid is making our life a lot easier. Let's remove this here. And of course, this could just be 3. And then we would get another row here. And this row, by the way, is called an implicit row, while these 2 here are called explicit rows. And that's because these first 2 rows, we actually did specify some sizes for them, right? And so we explicitly defined these 2 rows, while this third one here was basically just added automatically because we run out of space in the grid that we defined. And so this row here that was added automatically is called an implicit row. And in fact, we do have a way of styling implicit rows, but that is outside the scope of this course. So usually we just always define an explicit grid like we did here. So by using these two properties. So let's set it back to 4. And now let's move on quickly to rows, because the FR unit is actually also available on rows. So let's try that. And in order to do this, we actually first need to give the container a height, because otherwise there's not really anything to fill, right? So let me show that to you. And I will move that up here again with the Option or Alt up key. Let's put that here. And grid template rows. And so as I was saying, if we just do this, because then there's no space to fill, but actually there is some space. So these rows are quite tall, but let me explain you why that is happening. So just like before, we have this one element which is 150 pixels tall, right? And so therefore this entire row here will then be 150 pixels tall as well. And so therefore that is then 1 FR, all right? So again, the height of this track, this row track here, is defined by its tallest element, which is this one here with 150 pixels. And so therefore then the entire height of this row is 1 FR as we defined it here. And so then the second track gets the exact same height because, well, that has also 1 FR. But let's then now actually remove this here. And so this was the result I was expecting in the beginning. Okay, so now these are still the same size because they're still 1 FR, but the size is now defined by this row because this here is the height that is necessary to create this row. But now, as I was saying, let's actually define a height for this container. So if we say like 600 pixels, then you see that it looks very different. Let's make it a bit smaller. And yeah, so by creating a height for this container, we added a lot of empty space, which could now be filled by these two fractional units, right? And just like before, we could of course make this one taller, like double as tall, by giving it double diffractions. Okay, let's put it back. And usually the FR unit is actually more helpful on columns. Okay, so in fact, in many situations, it's actually enough to only define columns and let the rows be filled automatically. Now, just one final thing is that, of course, the auto keyword is also available for rows. So now this only takes the space it needs, and all the remaining space is automatically filled up by this one here, so by this first row track, which has the fractional unit. All right, and with this, you actually already learned many of the most important fundamentals of CSS Grid. So with this, we can already create some pretty useful grids in the real world. However, let's actually take it one step further in the next lecture and learn how to actually manually place and span grid items inside of our grid container.